One afternoon I decided to go out and buy a Mega Drive. So I told my parents that I was going to go on a walk, took my backpack and a bundle of notes and set off. As I walked, my excitement was building and it kept on increasing. I was going to buy a Mega Drive, or at least some sort of console, but really I knew it was going to be a Mega Drive and I knew exactly which one it was going to be. For some reason going there felt dodgy, as though I was planning a heist. As I walked, I passed by the house of an old friend I hadn't spoken to for 2 years. She used to be properly into Sonic, so I got the idea into my head that as soon as I got the console, it was off to buy a copy of Sonic 2 and an extra controller, then to trek all the way back to her house, hook it up and play together for a while. And I knew exactly where I was going to find that cartridge too. It seemed like the perfect plan. So, a couple of miles later, I arrived at the shop with the Mega Drive, and there in the front window it sat on its Mega CD plinth, gleaming at me through the glass. Then I stepped towards the moment of truth, and, unfortunately, a long queue. Ah well, I don't mind waiting. I saw they had a very decent Dreamcast selection, that the Xbox games were all ridiculously cheap, that Chibi Robo was marginally more expensive than Gotcha Force. Eventually I got to speak to a man who seemed a bit older than me, but not quite old enough to know what a Mega Drive is. This proved to be true, as after studying a few game boxes for no discernible reason, he returned to the till with a front-loading Mega CD which cost more than my life. I told him that the thing I wanted was sitting in the front window. Eventually he found the right machine among mounds of indistinguishable yet somehow totally different consoles and brought it to the counter. I got him to separate the console from its plinth and put the latter back, and then he, no doubt exasperated at my demands, printed off the receipt as I counted out my money. Another man who worked there mentioned something probably relevant about some palaver that had happened involving some other branch of the shop, to which I found myself responding, "Hey, what can you do?" I couldn't help pointing out my new console was missing a bit of plastic that fits over this bit, but of course the previous owner had got rid of that long ago. Anyway, they found the relevant controller and wires and I was off at last. I now owned a Mega Drive. Sure, it was missing a bit of plastic and it came with an RF cable instead of at least composite, but it was a Mega Drive, and it was my Mega Drive. Well, next I got to get Sonic 2. I arrived at the shop which I knew had this game maybe a mile later and looked at its Sega section, right down by the floor in a corner. And there it was, that masterpiece of platforming. Oh wait, it was the Master System version, good luck playing that on a Mega Drive. So that was odd. I was sure I'd seen the proper 16-bit version. Either it had been sold in the meantime, or I was blind with a memory a goldfish would be ashamed of. Thankfully they had Sonic 1 as well. Or the case at least, someone had lost the actual cartridge. Out of desperation, I scoured the titles. Well, there was Lemmings, and The Lion King. Not the greatest two-player experiences around, and of course they didn't have any Mega Drive controllers in stock. I left the shop, needless to say, I wouldn't be repairing old friendships today. So I was missing that bit of plastic, I had a low-quality video cable I probably wouldn't even be able to use on a modern TV, I only had one controller and no games, but hey, I had my Mega Drive. The reason I had decided to go for this console at this time was one game in particular, which I was going to order online. At least to be able to play that, eventually. But at that time I was thirsty, and I had been out for quite a long time, so I went home. I arrived within seconds of the rest of my family. They had had an hour-long walk themselves and were surprised about how long I had been out. When asked where I had gone, I just said, around. I quickly went upstairs and took the stuff out of my backpack, plugged the controller into the console just to take it fitted. Yes, it did fit into its socket, but it barely fit in my hands. Compared to the N64 controller, it felt gigantic, the buttons comically large and a real stretch to reach. Then I realised I was overreacting. But I had a Mega Drive! My very own 16-bit console, bought with my own money. Might as well check the cables as well, just to be sure. They were the wrong cables. They didn't fit. I'd been sold the wrong cables for my console. Ah well, I can take them back and have them swapped. Put the console into a drawer where no one would see it. Decided to check on the internet to see whether that game I wanted, that I needed, was still available. Pier Solar, one of the latest Mega Drive games from 2010, many years since the console's final release, one of the greatest games on the console, terrific RPG, limited edition, yet still available last time I checked. But typically it had been sold out sometime in the past 2 months. The eBay listings looked terrifying too. At this rate it seemed as though my console would turn out to be an empty shell, or that I'd never even bought it in the first place. I also looked up exactly which cables they'd given me. Based on what I knew, the shop had 2 Mega CDs, and the man who served me seemed fairly inept about retro things, and based on what I found online, I figured out that there'd been a mix-up at the shop, and they'd simply picked up the wrong set of cables accidentally, or they'd been mislabelled. A simple mix-up anyway. The day after, I cycled back there with the wrong cables. This time the shop was mostly empty, so I went straight up to the counter and made my request to no one in particular. The man who happened to be nearer to the direction I pointed my request in seemed kind of startled that anyone was in the shop at that hour of the day. I don't think he said anything in particular in reply before this other guy got involved. After a bit of thinking, he told me that yet another employee had been a bit of a silly and had mixed up the cables for a version 1 console with the version 2 console that I had. Even better, the version 1 console along with my cables was taken all the way to Northampton of all places, while I had its cables halfway across the country. And what's more, someone in Northampton had bought the version 1 console with my cables, and whoever it was in pretty much the same situation as I was. So they were trying to contact that person, get them to bring back my cables so that I could hand over their cables and bring them back to Northampton. It all seemed fairly convoluted. He then told me that I should come back tomorrow or the day after to finally finish my already overlong trade with that shop. I thanked him for the explanation and decided to come back in 2 days to increase the odds of everything panning out alright. I also began to consider turning the experience into a YouTube video. So 2 days later I dutifully cycled back there and arrived spattered all over with mud and rain. This time my request to the man at the till was even more incoherent than usual thanks to exhaustion, but I eventually explained my situation after a bit of dithering. A while later, the man I had spoken to 2 days before surfaced and told me how the guy I had just talked to was the very same person who has got the cables mixed up in the first place, and that he had come all the way here from Northampton, but somehow the message hadn't got through that he was meant to bring cables back. The plot thickens and becomes yet harder to follow. He ended by saying that all this nonsense was quite literally a case of crossed wires, and laughed slightly too long at his little joke, and I was to come back in 6 days' time. I was so out of it that I nearly left the shop without someone else's cables. I knew that I really ought to have an actual game or two so that I hadn't simply bought an expensive piece of useless 90s plastic, so the next day I returned to the shop with the wrong Sonic 2 and quickly looked into the Lemmings and Lion King boxes to make sure they actually contained games, which they did. The latter even contained a small piece of lined paper which someone had written a few cheat codes on. Knowing that game's reputation for unfairness, I thought keeping this might come in handy. I stood up again and did my customary awkward pause not far from the counter as I deliberated whether or not to buy stuff. A man walked in front of me and appeared to make a last-minute Nintendo Switch pre-order, but soon there was no more fighting the inevitable, and before I quite knew what was going on, I had handed over my money and was walking away carrying a plastic bag of Sega goodness. Then, the day of the cables, TM, finally came. That lunchtime at school, I made the trip back to the Sonic 2 shop and quickly picked up another 2 games there. They also had a second controller in stock, which I expressed my interest in, but it turned out that the wire coming out of it was frayed, so I passed it up. One random box in that shop contained the missing Sonic 1 cartridge from earlier. I'd put it back in its correct case, but some fool had apparently already bought that. I also noticed that the Mega Drive version of Sonic 2 still did exist. They just put it into a glass cabinet where I had managed not to notice it earlier. All the while though, I looked forward to the end of school where I could finally make my soulless bit of plastic complete with a couple of worthless cables. Cycled back to the other shop, was instantly recognised by my school uniform when a man I had seen before simply asked me, "Sega Mega Drive?" We swapped plastic bags and I could have ended up 1 controller richer if not in my honesty. I was off, just like that, and I knew that my Mega Drive misadventures had finally come to an end, but as you can see from the length of this video, they hadn't. When I got home I was anxious to try my wonderful new blast processed monster, but I held off until the living room was free. Then I stealthily recovered the console from its hiding place and set it up on a small table next to the TV. Mercifully, the cables fitted. I stuck the other end of the RF wire into the back of the VCR, put in Lemmings, switched on the console, set the TV to SCART, and waited. Not 1 second a video game appeared on the screen. Tried plugging the thing into the back of the TV, though I knew I'd have to somehow tune it to the terrestrial channel 36. Unsurprisingly, the only picture that showed was EastEnders, as I didn't have it tuned to an analog channel. Put the plug back into the VCR, tried another cartridge, flipped the switch on the cable a couple of times. Nothing! Back into the back of the TV. Stuck the aerial cable into the switch box, just in case. Did an analog channel scan. Nothing. I was starting to think that maybe there was something wrong with the power cable. I couldn't tell whether or not the console was even on, as Sega had decided not to put an indicator light on it. Still, the brick did sound as though electricity was running through it. Found the nearest screwdriver to take a look inside the console and check that all the circuitry was intact. Sure, the circuit board was dusty, but it looked completely normal. But wait, there was an indicator light all along. Looks like I'd not managed to get it even switched on in the first place. Stuck the power cable in as far as it could go and turned the console on. The LED glowed happily. Put the console back together, plugged everything in as before, made sure the power cable stayed at precisely the right angle for the light to stay on. Did everything I'd done before. Nothing. manually adjusted the analog channel on the TV to 391.25 MHz, which must have taken 15 minutes at least, cleaned the Lemmings cartridge with a cotton bud, blew into every last orifice in the machine, messed about with all the settings again. Still no picture. Right. I could think of 3 possible explanations for that nonsense. 1, that the cable simply didn't work. 2, that some connection in the console was broken. 3, that the TV simply couldn't pick up that particular RF signal. All 3 possibilities were very irritating, and of them the third seemed the least likely, but that was what I was going to try out as soon as possible. If that wasn't the problem, then it seemed my only choice was to go back to the shop and tell them everything was wrong. 2 weeks after the console became mine, I brought a really big fat TV from the 70s from my grandparents' house back home. I knew there was no chance of it working, seeing as when I tested it the CRT wasn't making its characteristic high-pitched buzz. Still, me and my mum carted it upstairs and landed it in the middle of my bedroom floor. I found out that the TV was only able to pick up channels 1 to 16, no chance of the channel 36 I needed. Still I didn't give up, and soldiered on through channel after channel of meaningless static. But then when I got to channel 10, I caught the faint but unmistakable sound of the brilliant Desert Strike theme, cutting through the uniform blanket of white noise. After a bit of tuning I got a nice sharp picture, only it was in black and white, and the sound was atrocious. Still, after 2 weeks of annoyance and impatience, it was working, and I didn't need to go and find a replacement cable. While playing Lemmings, I realised that the horrible buzz changed depending on what was on the screen, and subsided completely during a fade to black. I came to the conclusion that the TV was being a bit synesthetic, somehow interpreting colour as sound, but no further tuning could fix that problem. For a moment while playing The Lion King, a flash of colour appeared, but it quickly vanished again. 20 days after buying the Mega Drive, I went on another one of those long walks, mostly for the purpose of buying N64 games. On the way, I went into a charity shop and found, joy of joys, a nice CRT TV, new enough to be able to access the legendary Channel 36, small enough to be carried home on foot, kind enough to have sockets to plug in both Mega Drive and N64, and cheap enough to be a no-brainer. Next to it sat a titchy PS2, but without a controller included that didn't seem worthwhile. Anyway, I'd come back for the TV on my return journey. So I came to the shop that had become my second home, told that man I'd managed to get the Mega Drive working. Yes, I did get the cables. Thanks to a misunderstanding as to whether or not I was being served, I spent much longer there than I had intended, so by the time I got back to the charity shop it was beginning to get dark, and it had of course shut. I had to come back on Monday after school, by which point someone else would have already seized the opportunity. Gotta be prompt then. Further along I saw in the window of the shop that used to be a post office, a whole display of retro stuff, crowned with a majestic Master System. Loads of PS1 including Rayman, and hidden in the middle a nice Sonic 2. Half a mile from my house and I'd never noticed it to this day. Got to go there on Monday as well. Everything was falling neatly into place. I'll be doing that friendship revitalisation thing in no time at all at this rate. So, along comes Monday afternoon. I cycle away from school as quickly as possible, stopping at the former post office to see whether it was open. And it wasn't. Looked at the opening times. Turns out it closes at around the same time as I leave school, so there's no chance of me ever getting there unless I go on a Saturday morning. So that was a bit of a bust. No matter, however, as I could still get that TV that day, assuming it hadn't been sold yet. So I brought my bike home depositing my bag, and walked to the charity shop, conscious of how light I felt without my overfull school bag weighing me down. When I got to the shop I noticed the PS2 had of course been sold, but thankfully not the TV. So I bought it for its nominal price, and began carrying it home. Several people smiled and stared as I inexplicably carried this long obsolete grey box around. I smiled and laughed back, conscious of how absurd it all looked. To one who was driving but stopped to look, I replied, I have my reasons. It was all very jolly, even though my arms felt like they were burning up for the most part. So I brought it upstairs as my dad moved the even larger, even older TV out of my room, and set up the Mega Drive, anxious to finally play in colour with non-terrible sound. When I turned it on, I quickly noticed the television didn't have a channel 36, nor even a channel 10 for suboptimal but at least somewhat manageable gameplay. It only had channels 1 to 6 and, inexplicably, 80. This made perfect sense when the thing was new, when there were only 6 channels anyway, but for me it was one step backwards. Now while my Mega Drive journey was really going off the rails at this point, my N64 adventure was flying along right on course. Of course that console worked flawlessly on this new TV. And what's more, I had 12 games on that thing, 2 perfectly working controllers, potentially, an expansion pack, a working memory card, and non-terrible video cables on it. By comparison, my Mega Drive just looks sad. That was that then. I had to go out of my way, presumably to the internet, to find a SCART cable. If I didn't, all this time and money spent on the thing would have been wasted, all for nothing. On Saturday morning, 27 days after I bought the Mega Drive, I dutifully set off for the former post office, money from my slowly dwindling supply restless in my pocket. The shop, when I reached it, was as unfocused as I had heard it was, stocking clothes, toys, postcards and miscellanea, with its glass cabinet of retro gaming in one corner. It drew me to itself. There was Sonic 2, just waiting for me, and Rayman was still there too. I might just come back for it if I had enough money left. I asked the man at the till to unlock the cabinet, and I withdrew the appropriate case, paid for it, and set off to get some Mother's Day chocolate, which was the reason I had gone out in the first place. After I'd bought that, I realised I had enough left for Rayman, but the absurdity of my desire for it struck me. I didn't have anything to play the game on. I didn't intend to buy a PS1, at least not just yet. The consoles I had were quite enough to be getting on with. I already owned one sadistically difficult 2D platformer in the form of the Lion King, so I passed the shop by. But the urge was too strong, so I turned back to the shop and bought Rayman. The shopkeeper laughed and said, "It's addicting, isn't it?" I agreed, that pretty much got it on the nose. I despaired on the way home. On Thursday morning, 32 days after I bought the Mega Drive, I went out on another of my long walks. This time I wasn't buying any games. After the Rayman incident, I had it set in my mind that I did not want to buy any more games for a long time. Instead, this was specifically to look for a SCART cable or a second controller, as I wanted my plan to finally come to fruition. So I visited the two usual suspects, but the shop where I bought the games was shut, metal grille over the entire frontage. It looked to me as though the place was shut for good, though I couldn't really tell. I then thought of all the things which I would never buy from there, which saddened me a bit. Going back there a while later, I noticed it wasn't shut for good. Naturally, the other shop where I bought the console didn't seem to have any relevant controllers lying around. Slightly desperate, I even checked several charity shops on the way back home, but nothing I was looking for surfaced. So I made my mind up. I was going to bite the bullet and just get these things online. Felt like a bit of a cop-out Deus Ex Machina ending to this epic saga, but I was giving up. I was throwing in the towel. Enough messing about, I just want to play this thing at last. So after a day of deliberating, I ordered a SCART cable and controller online, and the following day the cable arrived. Finally, after 34 days of being a useless piece of plastic, my Mega Drive would truly come into its own. Although there wasn't really enough space in my desk for both consoles and the TV and games and everything, I got it all plugged in and working. Sonic 2 was a ton of fun. I suppose I sort of half expected the controls to be unbearable, as my only prior experience of Sonic controls was about a minute on Sonic Rush when I was too young to know how to video games. Thankfully, however, they were as intuitive as I had heard them touted, in spite of feeling nothing like Mario whatsoever. That was 1 hour or so well spent, and I couldn't wait to share such a fun game with my friend. It'd have to wait until the second controller came though. And the second controller did come, not too long after the SCART lead. Told my friend as soon after as possible. She was enthusiastic and I was looking forward. By this point I knew that Sonic 2 didn't have co-op multiplayer, but the versus mode would make up for that. And a while later I realised it actually did have co-op multiplayer, but ignore that fact, never mind. I quickly realised that as I would be on holiday for the week before Easter, she would have to know I would be away for that time. Unfortunately, she replied that her dog had got cancer, with only a few months left to live. All downhearted, she really wasn't in the mood to meet up for video games. So concludes my Mega Drive adventure. Insert cliche Robert Burns quote here. Of course, we are intending to meet up at some point. That seems a long way off now. Even so, it could happen. Still, life does its stuff. Bad things happen, and video games can't always be pretended to be the first priority. And now at least it doesn't feel like they are. Yes, I now have a Mega Drive and it's great and I really enjoy it, but when the main reason you got something turns out to be untenable, it sort of loses part of its appeal, doesn't it?